Oh hey guys, Patrick here. So I'm just in Montreal right now. I had an aerial rescue course here a couple days ago, but while I'm here, it is Sunday and I wanted to get a video out for you guys. So this is a webinar that I did about a month ago with Paul Poynter. Paul is an English climber who lives in Japan, and I've followed him for a while online. He goes by the handle WoodenHand, the nickname WoodenHand. And he has an amazing blog. He puts out a lot of good content, so I've been watching his stuff for quite a while. And he put this talk on at the end of February 2023. So in this talk we go into the usage of two ropes in tree climbing, the drawbacks and the benefits, and how to set it up and how he uses it. Basically all of the experimentation that he has put into it over the past few years. This particular issue has gotten very politicized. So in this talk, we're not talking about the official from the top rules down, like being forced to use two ropes. We're not talking about that. The way that they are in the UK, for instance. This is just about the voluntary use of two ropes and why you might use two ropes and when it makes sense. So I think you'll get a lot out of this. I know that I did. I think two of the key takeaways for me are, I believe that that two rope usage is a gear dependent technique. In my opinion, most of the climbing systems that you can try with two ropes, they just don't work very well. And so most people who try two ropes with whatever systems they have, it doesn't work very well, and they come away thinking, oh, this is terrible. But I believe it's a gear dependent technique, no different than trying to climb SRT with a hitch cord requires a rope wrench, right? So and then the other key takeaway for me, I've been actively exploring two rope usage over the past 3 years, and what I have found is the more I use two ropes, the more I realize just how useful and beneficial it is to have two ropes. So I don't want to be ideological about it, you know what I mean? I'm very pragmatic about two ropes. I use two ropes when it makes sense. And all I'm saying is the more I use it, the more I realize it makes more sense in more situations than I ever thought that it would. So I'm rambling here a bit. So check out this webinar with Paul Poynter, who goes by the nickname WoodenHand. I think you'll get a lot out of it. I know I did. All right, check it out.
I said in December on Instagram that I wanted to do this throughout the winter period, and it's nearly March now, and I just thought if I don't do it, even if it's like not really well organized, I probably won't do it, until the spring, and that really irks me. So it's not the most organized talk today, but hopefully there's enough to give you guys some things to chew on anyway. Okay, well, let's get going. So definition of two rope. Two work positioning lines that are generally tied into a central point throughout the climb. Both lines give equal security to the climber. Their lines may be designed to redirect into different parts of the tree. They are anchored independently, but can be co-joined to facilitate retrieval. There are numerous ways to explore anchor settings. So that's generally how I define how I perceive and use two rope. What two rope is not is a second system that is set and reset throughout the climb, i.e. a long lanyard or a short moving rope system. So I hope that's clear. So it's not going in with one and then pulling out a second and putting that into an area to give you balance stability when you need it, and then retrieving it and then it going into a bag or being dropped on the floor. It's a dedicated system that, so think of it like when you go into work normally, you have a long rope and then you have a side lanyard. You have your list of required items. You have your helmet, you have your whatever, your safety glasses, your lanyard, your rope. And for me, it's 2 ropes. It's always 2 ropes going in with 2 ropes. And those are anchored to a central point as you would with 1 rope, but you're just putting 2 ropes in there. So you have 2 ropes to use from the beginning until the end. Okay, so maybe you guys have heard of over here there's an arb retailer called ODSK, who run a bunch of climbing and rigging workshops that I help design. I design the workshops and I also teach at some of them. The guy who runs it, called Keisan, he harangued me for years to explore 2 anchor systems, not 2 rope systems, but 2 anchor systems. And this stemmed from Japan's legal requirement for work at height systems to be, backed up, whatever that means. It's a grey zone, and Japan has no code of practice for tree workers, so there's no actual technical guidance as there is now in the UK. Love it or hate it, there is at least an industry code of practice in the UK now. Nothing like that in Japan. Bizarrely, we are required to wear full body harnesses here, but not obliged to use the fall arrest point. Strange. Legally, we are allowed to move between workstations on 1 line, but must have a second line when, working. It doesn't make too much logical sense. Thankfully, we are not required to apply industrial access systems into trees. Not yet, anyway. So this was about two years ago, I think. Can't quite remember exactly. So eventually I began to, on behalf of Keisan, I began to explore ideas. And it started with, wondering what kind of device would pair in well with my, normal work positioning system. So I think at the time I was on a rope runner, or something like that. So what would go in with the rope runner that wouldn't become such a hindrance that I could, use with both hands, that would be quick to install and deinstall and not too heavy, not too cumbersome. Yeah, so finding a second device and then working out how to anchor them cleanly, redirect them and still retrieve. So some of you have mentioned this already, how, basically how you can make a two work position system just clean in its entirety from start to finish. So I made an anchoring system that was interesting but overly complex. Somebody mentioned it just now. It's you can read it on my blog. So for the device at that time, I started with just an eye-to-eye hitch cord and a pulley, which, as you know, ordinarily you shouldn't use just a hitch cord on a single line, because if you put all of your body weight onto it, it's going to bind up. But I was finding that I didn't, in the beginning, I called it a positioning line, not a working line. So I would have my main line. This is how the definition, I would have my main line. And then the new line, it would be a positioning line. So that would come out and then redirect and be, give me 2 points of contact. So for most of the time, I was sharing loads. I was able to use the hitch up and down quite easily, but there'd be times when I would go all my body weight onto that hitch. So it became a bit problematic. So I stopped doing it. I've got quite a long history with the Unicender, and I stopped using it for many, many years. But when I was doing my TRT stuff, TRT is great, but for just straight up, getting up a tree really quick, you can't really beat just a single SRT line. So I always had my Unicender just for access. So I'd been using the Unicender for a while as a main device, then a second system when I was climbing on TRT. So by that time, I'd worked out that it configures well with a tether for ascent. So I decided to give it a spin as a, as a second work positioning device. And I guess you guys, most of you, well, all of you, I guess, you've seen my stuff on Instagram, so you know that I've put this eye to eye below the Unicender, which kind of freaks out a lot of people, like, what the hell? So it's a split tail, basically. A split tail being a traditional or an older style system that you have one connection point on a piece of rope that goes up and then wraps around into a hitch, a Blake's hitch or a taut line hitch. So you have some distance between your bridge and then where the thing's biting onto the rope. Yeah. Without really thinking about it, just taking it from the access system with the tether and then putting it into the second system, I just straight away loved having the device away from me. It was really novel and like a new way to move. The SRS stationary rope system split tail device was so easy to move around the tree on. Also, the Unicender it's really fast to put on and off rope. Yeah, this is not a Unicender commercial, by the way. It's just I get there's a lot of mileage that I can take out of that simple tool. So it was obvious straight away that if the two rope system was to be used to its potential, one rope should be redirected to give the climber a static hang in a wide area. So one rope, if you hang yourself on one rope, it gives the climber a static hang in one position. And as you know, the most perfect work position is like from above, these so-called sky huts that we always dream about having. So one rope gives you that, the gravity is pushing down in one motion. Then obviously, if you put a second anchor in and they're meeting, so you have two pendulums, so that pendulum is stopping that pendulum from moving back, and vice versa. So between those A and B point, making sure that this rope angle doesn't exceed about 120 degrees, which would then put too much force on the anchor points. The climber is able to very carefully micromanage their positioning, so they can have a static hang anywhere between point A and point B. Not just in a line, but also downwards too. Is that clear? Pretty clear, I hope. So this means, to achieve that, basically means that you want to learn how to redirect ropes, because you're going to want to learn how to redirect ropes. And one thing that really helps when you're redirecting ropes is a device that could come on and off rope really easily. So again, the Unicender is really good for that. Okay, so two lines are a pain in the arse to manage. I have been using TRT. TRT, for those that don't know, within one device, it's using two 8mm lines. So I was using two 8mm lines in a rope runner that was kind of looped over. So obviously below the device, there's two tails that, you have to learn how to deal with. So since about 2014, I couldn't believe that when I wrote this yesterday. What time flies, I'm becoming very old. So climbing on TRT since 2014, I was at a distinct advantage when I began taking seriously dual systems. I had learned how to climb with, manage and utilize the two legs. They're not just a hindrance, you can put them to working use. So for example, they can form an additional system, as Andrew mentioned. They can be used for traversing. They can be used for pulling up and lowering down gear. And obviously, one can be used for pulling up and lowering down gear, while the other one's, doing something else. If you only have one, you only have an option to use it for one thing. It can be used for controlling pendulum returns. I think somebody mentioned that also. Forming mechanical advantage, pulling out hung up branches. I guess I'd run out of ideas at that point. and obviously redirects, etc., whatever that means. So a typical philosophy of efficiency implies that less is more. Less is more. Less of everything, I think. Less techniques, less equipment, less movement. Something that I really admire about the MRS system is the simplicity of just putting the working end through your anchor, clipping it to you, and then it's all done. You know, comparatively, SRS, it's a real ball ache to rig and think about, and how's it going to retrieve, and what kind of anchor. And yeah, I love the beautiful efficiency of MRS anchoring. Just put it over and it's done. It's slick and it's easy. And I try as much as possible to bring that specific idea into my SRS anchoring too. Also, the good use of fair lead pulleys. When I say fair lead pulley, do you guys understand? So a device, let's say the rope runner has a little pulley on the bottom. So I think they're often called slack tending pulleys. You would like pull up the device to tend out the slack. But also, okay, let's go into a bit more detail. If you guys have seen the hitch climber pulley, the sheave on the hitch climber, do this with my fingers, the sheave on the hitch climber goes right down to the bottom of the plates. So if you notice, for those of you who've been climbing more than 8 years, the first hitch climber pulleys, the sheave didn't go down to the bottom of the side plate. It stopped a few millimeters above it. And then they redefined it. So the sheave, it created this really beautifully blended line all the way around. And that was so the rope, when it was deflected over branches from any angle, would be able to slide into the device super slick and efficiently. So that's a fair lead. The rope is being fair led into the device. So I'm talking about the philosophy of efficiency. Fair lead pulleys allow the standing part to deflect over branches and flow smoothly into the device. So route planning and keeping drop zones clear mean that rope tails will inevitably need to be lifted and reset into different sections of the tree. Do this frugally by utilizing the fair lead. So yeah, with TRT, having two tails and pulling two tails around, and then those two tails getting wrapped around each other and knotted, and having to pull the two up and then resetting them. You know, that's a process that I went through in the beginning. And then I learned basically, wherever possible, not to touch the rope that's below the device. Just let it flow around as I move. So this is utilizing the fair lead pulley to its utmost. The Unicender does not have a fair lead pulley. So I'll show you a bit about this later. I clip one of these in. So the foundations of my climbing system and what I consider major points of technique and also equipment choice. So again, try to achieve the most with the least. What I'm finding more and more, you know, this is still a learning process for me too. What I'm finding more and more that my climbing, the way I conceptualize my climbing system now is really, really similar to how I conceptualize rigging systems. You know, and I think in our there's quite a distinction between what a rigging system is and what a climbing system is. And then stationary rope systems seem to kind of break that barrier a little bit. So, you know, stationary rope systems, they're good for redirecting. So stationary rope system climbers, they think about compression and vectors. And, you know, this is rigging theory, not necessarily something that a typical MRS climber would necessarily have to think about. So achieve the most with the least. Like rigging theory, the weight that you're moving or the body that you're moving should be secured and moved with ease. as much as is possible, the system is not redesigned and remade throughout the working process. And I think for those of you that do rigging, one thing that you strive for when you arrive at that job and you think about how you're going to design and apply the system is that you want to situate it to do the most without then having to rethink and reset it, you know, which is a difficult thing, and you get better at it with experience, obviously. And in the same vein, I try to design my climbing system in exactly the same way. So, yeah. So a typical climbing system, one rope and one lanyard, means that the climber has continuous work positioning design and work positioning setting problems each time they cut. I'll just read that one more time. A typical climbing system, which would be one long rope and one shorter lanyard, means that the climber has continuous work positioning design and setting problems each time they cut. So you would move on one rope on your pendulum out to your point. You would reach your point, and as you reach it on the pendulum, your muscles are engaged, your muscles are firing, you're finding balance, you're moving well, but your body's under tension. So typically, you know, a good work positioning is making the body relaxed. So you then have to, in that particular location, you have to think how you're going to apply the lanyard to that point. You know, a place that's going to give you enough strength to hold your body with stability, not necessarily enough strength for the branch to snap if the main line is cut. That's not always possible, but at least it's going to triangulate you, and you're going to be able to relax your body to then do the work that you have to do. And as you know, trees, you know, every single part of the tree is quite different. So every time when you reach that point, you then have to re-engage the brain and wonder where you're going to put the lanyard, and then set it and then check it, you know, and that's time as well. And then you do the cut, and then the lanyard's off, and then you go to the next point, and then it's the same thing again, repeated. That's my experience anyway. So what you get with two ropes encompass, or they encompass several parts of your work positioning scenarios, or they encompass many, or sometimes even all. You can set two ropes and you can literally do all of your cutting without ever having to deploy the lanyard, which enables the climber to move and cut, move and cut, move and cut very quickly, very easily too, because the body is basically in a state of relaxation. As the body is hung from those two pendulums, the body is able to just hang vertically in a relaxed way, and all you're doing is manipulating the device. So this may sound a bit strange, but I backward engineered the climbing system, knowing the goal, which was to achieve a static and still position with 2 points of attachment. 2 points of attachment meaning, I'm not sure what they say in the US, but in the UK, we're asked by law, or previous to the new legislation, to have 2 points of attachment, which would be your main rope and your lanyard. So main rope only and cutting, that was, you know, perceived as a bad thing. So main rope and then lanyard, and then do your cut, which many people don't anyway. And I've, you know, for years and years, I ignored that too. You know, you just want to go and cut, go and cut. So with two ropes, you can go and cut, go and cut, go and cut, but you maintain those 2 points of attachment. So I backward engineered the climbing system, knowing the goal to achieve a static position with 2 points of attachment, and then I build this at the beginning of the climb. Build it at the beginning of the climb, as opposed to climbing, go to the workstation, set your 2, and then cut. And then, as I just mentioned, repeat. Even if both lines run parallel from the anchor, so you're not getting that point-to-point stability, even if they're just coming down parallel, 2 ropes and 2 devices, which may seem like a nonsense. For example, wrecking out pine trees, or something like that. Not needing to rig the lanyard to maintain 2 points of contact or additional stability is extraordinarily freeing. I can't understate that enough. Not deploying and redeploying the lanyard in that kind of scenario where it's, for the most part, it's pretty easy work. You're working ordinarily down with gravity and cut. If you can just move the workflow, if you can move like that with 2 points of contact, the workflow it's fun. It feels good. Yeah, movement on rope is inevitably slowed down on 2 rather than 1, but workflow actually speeds up. And I've written that in red. That really can't be understated too. Workflow is accelerated. Okay, we're good? Okay, technique specific to 2 rope. Releasing one suspension point while staying suspended. So you're on 2 ropes, you can release one and you're still on 1. That's a major advantage of being on 2 ropes. There's various implications for it. 2-point suspension is super easy for passing limbs and taking redirects. 2-dimensional suspension, I mentioned it before. So when you're between 2 points, you have that micro management of micro space management, which it's not really achievable on 1 rope. And then moving on 2 opposed pendulums, we're not really going to get into that today, but rather than moving directly up a rope, if you're able to use, as when you're moving on the pendulum, you push into the rope and your body becomes lighter. So you can do that, and then but you alternate each side. So yeah, that's something else for another time. Okay, Unicender and why I use tethers. The Unicender blends in seamlessly as a second system device. The reason being, fast to install, few parts. Also, keep safety hand while descending. Okay, I'm going to have to show you this. So the Unicender has a unique feature for descent. So you can grab the device and use it, or you can wrap it over, and then it becomes like a figure-8 descender. So, as you know, typical practice for descending on a rope is you have 1 rope activating the device, and then you have your control hand, like so, either way. With 2 devices, and operating them like this, you've lost your control hand. And what I say to when I'm teaching people about trying to push them into using 2 ropes, I don't care what your initial device is. but I completely advise that the second device be a Unicender. And and I've seen somebody have accidents, while training, because they operate and they come out of control, so an uncontrolled descent. So what you can do, you can operate your initial device as you would, grabbing it, and then you can put the control hand by your hip, and then the Unicender, the second device, is wrapped over, and it can also be held by your hip. And then you open and then you pull, and then you're able to, with two devices, come down in a controlled way. Does that make sense? So back to Unicender and tethers. Also, as I mentioned before, I feel really, really comfortable on a split tail design. Yeah, as I was writing this, I'd remembered, I don't have one here maybe, I made a little SRT booklet that some of you may have seen, a blue book. And for those that you have it, open it to Lawrence Schultz's page, and you can see that he's using two rope runners in the illustration, and the two rope runners have tethers on. And I think his reason was just, without the tethers, the devices are too close together and they can just clash around too much. So having them at a distance means that kind of clashing is lessened. So I feel comfortable on a split tail design. A device attached close to the bridge point, you tend slack by lifting the rope, but the Unicender with the tether it acts more like a hand ascender. Just slide the device up the rope. So slide the device up the rope rather than lifting the rope to push the device. Slide the device up the rope rather than lifting the rope to push the device. It's a really distinct way of managing slack. And the way, for me too, this has ergonomic implications. It's a little tricky to describe in words, and not really one to talk about on a Zoom session, but the way that I manage slack, I move my body below the device, and as I stand, simultaneously slide the Unicender up along the rope. So it's about training your center of gravity movement and also your footwork. Rope climbing typically begins in a way that is fatiguing. Apart from the ergonomic approach to stationary rope system and rope walking, beyond this, there seems to be very little taught about micro movement, in my experience anyway. Almost zero about gripping patterns of the hand, how to grip, literally, how to push or grip, and then footwork too. I've never heard anybody talk about it. To be blunt, a climber is asked to be nothing if not physical, which obviously cycles towards physical failures. Okay, so the tether. This is this might sound like nothing, but one thing that's really, really nice. So typically, if I'm clipped in, it's typically going to be about here. My bridge is going to be about that far. So if you want to move to the other side of the rope, and a device that's slowed down with a fairly pulley here, you have to lift the rope up and put it over your shoulders and then move around. Correct? So there's a big space here for me to move under, so I can just open the rope and dip under it. Which may sound like nothing, but that action is repeated so many times throughout a climb, as you're all aware. So not having to, and there might be 20 meters of rope that I'm lifting up here. In the Pacific Southwest, there might be 50 meters of rope that you're lifting up here. So just open the doorway and dip under it. It's a minor thing, but it's a helpful thing. Another reason for the tether. So when I'm rope walking, obviously you want your body to be as upright as possible. You don't want any lean in the system. Upright means efficient. And then what I do is I clip my chest tether directly into the rope. And then as I ascend, my chest tether just pushes up the Unicender. Having a tether on the device gives you a large amount of slack when you're climbing in the crown. So we're not always climbing on rope. There's a lot of time when we're just climbing in the tree, and it can be a lot of branches and complex morphology. So you need slack in the system at times. And I can generate 80 centimeters, 30 inches of slack, just like that. And then I can move. And then when it's time to reset, just lift the device back up and it's reset. So typically a smaller device doesn't move very fast, so you're not able to, not a smaller device, a device that's connected lower down onto the bridge. Even if you drop it, you're not generating a lot of slack. So ordinarily you have to pull out slack from the top of the device. And depending on the device, you then have to tie a marlin spike so the slack doesn't disappear back into the device. And then you move and then you reset all that. So again, the Unicender with the tether, drop it, you have about 30 inches, you move, and then you can simply reset it. Body thrusting, which body thrusting has a bit of a bad name, I think. People perceive it as bad ergonomically, but if you use your body well, body thrusting is a really, really good technique. Body thrusting, for those that don't know, is with a split tail MRS system, you would pull the rope down and then push the hitch, or with me, the Unicender up, and then the slack is reset. And then foot locking, having the device away enables me to get quite a nice, motion when I'm foot locking, and I just slide that up as I go. I tend to foot lock quite a lot. Less clashing of equipment, as I mentioned, with Lawrence's illustration. And then something that's kind of novel, I can clip in my fair lead pulley. And then when I'm pulling up some equipment, because I have the distance, I get quite a nice hauling action. So I'm using the top MRS point of the Unicender to clip in a hauling pulley. And because there's distance, I'm able to get quite a nice stride and haul. It's minor, but it's it's kind of interesting. Okay, is that okay? Carry on. Any questions?
Yeah, I don't know if you mentioned it already, but is there any situation where you would shorten the tether up and clip directly into the Unicender, or do you just leave it like that 100% of the time?
When I first began with it, I was so used to having a short attachment point when I was doing spar work. Spar work, standing on spurs and being lanyarded in. Having that kind of, taking off your lanyard and then basically walking down the stem and it being slack for that amount of space. That was kind of weird for me at first. But to be honest, Patrick, I just leave it as it is now. I've gotten used to it. And you could say it's not, it could be a slightly dangerous thing having that much slack available. If you were to kick out on your spurs and drop into it, you'd go like a fair amount of distance. So yeah, I mean, the thing is, with the tether, you can just take the carabiner off and like put it into the hole and shorten it up. But apart from that, no, I from the beginning, it's always just been left on. Is that okay? Okay, so spending time with my peers. There's always a lot of talk about work positioning techniques. And in my generation, at least, there was kind of a steering away from using the upper side Ds to lanyard techniques that would like inevitably they would go down onto the lower D points. If everyone knows what that means, the lower D points, or then putting a lanyard onto the the attachment point on the bridge, so a ring or a swivel. So having a main system and then learning how to find really good positions, re-rigging the lanyard from the storage point onto the bridge point, and then doing whatever you do, which makes sense because having systems clipped into the bridge gives you the most amount of, well, it gives you stability, but it also gives you access to movement. And if you're clipped into either the upper or lower points, your hips are kind of held captive. So again, this kind of backward engineering idea, two rope was my conclusion. Rig two systems from one point, and then the climber can move without restriction. I think I put some of this writing on Instagram, so I may be repeating myself, but here we go. If I was to explain the motivation for dedicated two-rope use in professional work to a total beginner, it begins with the obvious discussion of anchoring safety. While it is feasible to choose and safely work on one anchor, if the same principles are applied, then doubling the anchor allows an overall increase in safety and security. Easily understood. The difficulty and importance of conveying information leads me to believe that a reduction in technique allows a faster understanding of information. Using the motivation and goal of work positioning, then backwards engineering a system that can achieve it. It may be the most direct and safe way, starting at the end and working backwards. Understanding goals is key to development. What constitutes a climbing set as given? This is an open question. Like, what does constitute, 50 years back, what constitutes a given set? A set as given is not what we're climbing on now. And I'm going to imagine 50 years into the future, what we're using now is not going to be taken as typical for what is a climbing system. So what should we see as what should we take a climbing set as given? One rope, two prussics, a short lanyard. That's what I was taught in the UK 18 years ago. Possibly a couple of webbing slims for good measure. A rescue set, which all UK climbers clip onto the harness and never touch, and it just goes moldy. Which period of history should be drawn upon to extract techniques? Yesterday, today? How about tomorrow? How much of today's techniques are born out of yesterday's inadequacy? Rigging systems are created, set, and used to encompass as much of the work as possible. Redesigning and resetting throughout the working day is a pain. It's a waste of time. Climbing too. Try to create a system that encompasses as much of the work as possible. Stop chasing positions. Two anchors to span the work. It allows the climber effortless access to macro and micro positioning. Lanyard is deployed less. It's no longer the crux of safety when cutting. Robustness and resilience for equipment and technique. Can you define differences between major and minor techniques? Safety is laid out as a foundation. Skill and technique grow from it. Technique is born out of circumstance. It may sometimes be used once in a lifetime. Important yet minor. The so-called bag of tricks. Major techniques are constant. They are relied upon and trusted. They are dogged and resilient. and they should function in any circumstance. Learning how to throw rope is a major technique. Differences between friction hitches are minor techniques. Keeping things simple and safe, the KISS principle. And organizing techniques and equipment to function efficiently. It's tricky and it takes time to develop. The answer isn't retrograde. It takes work to KISS well. And, you know, the keep it, KISS, keep it simple, stupid, or keep it safe and simple, or how, you know, however you say it. It's not about using less equipment, you know, so the system's easily understood. You know, you have to think about the work in its entirety. So major techniques tend to have fewer stages and moving parts. They are unforgettable, like riding a bicycle. Minor techniques are filled with nuance and forgettable moments. Use major techniques over minor. Personally, I seem to carry less gear these days and use fewer techniques. I hope to hit more major points than minor, but obviously this is subjective and it changes through time. One major technique that I use all the time means that I have to constantly pull up and rig the standing end, you know, the rope below the device. Something that most of you will have done is to rig a natural crotch to use as a redirect. You lift the rope, you throw the rope, you set the rope, you rig it, and then you rig the device and then you climb on it. But using one system throws up some pretty serious grey areas of safety and inefficiency. How and when, within that point of taking a redirect, how and when do you reset the belay device? You know, if you're on one rope, you have to come off that belay device at some point. Where do you lanyard in? Is the lanyarding in point strong enough to hold you? I can't state enough how powerful it is to be in suspension and to quickly come off one line while still being suspended on another. It's just such a simple thing, but it's amazing to be on two systems and to be able to release one and re-rig it, but still having suspension here. So using two systems makes redirects completely simple for both setting and returning through them, as is passing limbs, or as Eric Whipple, some of you guys may know Eric he's up in Rhode Island. He calls it ghosting through limbs. You can literally like pass through limbs just by rigging one over and then the other in turn. Setting a redirect up close to the suspension point, simply pass the rope and device over the said point. Sorry, let me 1 second. Okay, let me go ahead and show you some illustrations. Guys, feel free to pass out questions whenever.
Have you found any solutions with using 2 rope wrenches as opposed to 2 unicenders if that's the only gear I can afford at the moment because I'm cheap?
I haven't done too much on 2 rope wrenches. I know it's possible. It's certainly possible. One thing that you lose when they're coming from two different angles, you have to use a hand directly on each one, so you lose the control hand. So that's one thing. When they're coming together, I'd imagine you can operate both hitches with one hand and then have a control hand. But then it's just taking redirects. It's not the end of the world to deinstall and reinstall a rope wrench, but it is what it is. But yeah, you can do it, of course.
Have you found with the Unicender? Have you found with the Unicender using two ropes, it is easier to control with squeezing the device?
Oh yeah, half the weight. Yes.
Okay.
Most definitely. Yeah.
What is your bridge setup like?
My bridge is.
And do you have multiple bridges?
It's two stitched eyes, and then I run I think it's called a rotator shackle from Rock Exotica.
Cool.
That's the bridge. Very simple.
I have a question about your rope choices.
Yeah.
Do you have two like ropes that are like the same length, or do you have one that's like really long and another one that's like not quite as long, or are they both kind of the same?
Yeah, so I'm basically two 30-meter lengths, and then about a 20 or 25-meter retrieve leg. Yeah, so the trees here, 30-meter with SRS, you can for the majority of trees, that's fine. And it gives me just enough length to, do a couple of redirects.
Okay.
But yeah, but basically identical lengths. Yeah.
Then the other question I have is, what are the implications with like a rescue scenario? With an aerial rescue and someone coming up to retrieve you if you're injured, running two systems as well as their own. Have you played around with that at all?
No, I haven't. I don't know if this is complacency on my part, but yeah, I used to do a lot of rescue training and also some workshops, and it's the company that I'm employed by, I've made sure that it's kind of protocol that everybody does rescue training and they know how to like go up and bring down somebody from up in the tree. They're still on one rope actually, so there's no requirement to use two ropes. So personally, the complacency thing, I mean, 18 years in and I've never ever even seen somebody have to do an aerial rescue.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't that describe something? I mean, that describes something, right? I'm not saying that it's unnecessary. Okay, so also I think self-rescue is the most important, and self-rescue comes obviously down to good work positioning and then good rope management. So having tails, having standing ends that are long enough to reach the floor so the climber can get down quickly, and then having tails that are not tangled and the climber can get down whenever they want to come down. So that's a really kind of key part of my kind of climbing concept. Also, having two systems, if the rescue climber comes up, there's an additional system there that they can use if they wanted to. So I think that's possibly something interesting to explore. It's already there and set up. Yeah. But yeah, let me know what you discover as you discover.
If I could add to your point, Paul.
Yeah.
So I think you were kind of saying this, where if the casualty is on two systems, you could utilize both. You could utilize one or the other. But I think also to Sam's point, it seems like where Sam's coming from is the idea of the rescue is we go up and we package and we operate the casualties descender with one hand and our own descender with the other hand. But that can be a good way to rescue. I think that what's lacking for most arborists, at least here in the US, is training in additional rescue scenarios like pickoffs. You know, other at height industries, there's standard rescues at pickoff. They're not operating someone else's descender one hand and operating their own with the other. And I think that's important because that could be, even if someone's only on one rope, if their system's compromised, how are you going to get them down?
Mhm.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, pickoff is defined as installing a separate rope, attaching the package, the victim, to that rope, and then them being usually lowered with control at the ground. So it would be like a three-man rescue.
Right. Team rescue, like you just described, I think that's important, but also just the ability to bring the casualty onto your system, and you bring them down to the ground.
Sorry, you're describing pickoff like that. Yes, sorry.
Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah. So, but I don't think anything changes, one rope or two ropes. Like, Sam, what do you, maybe I misunderstood what you were saying. Could you maybe just go in a bit more detail about the question? Because it seems very interesting.
My thought was like if the victim is suspended between two suspension points in the middle of that pendulum in open space where it's easy to position in open space, and wild scenario, stung by a bee, they're allergic, and being able to bring them down for more care would require a lot more effort in terms of operating both systems. I guess my thought is being worried about being suspended between 2 points that it is difficult for someone to access and get to.
Yeah.
And then operate both systems as well as their own for something that would be simple to like one system and bring them down.
But if you're following rescue preparations to a T, the rescue system should mirror the climber system anyway. So there should be rescue ropes already installed, on either side of the climber, so they're able to get there. Or thinking just imaginatively, if it's 2 60-meter trees that they're going up in, very wild trees, and there's a danger of being attacked by wasps or whatever, heat exhaustion or whatever, you could rig those 2 points to a basal point, and then have the ability to lower off straight away. And one thing that I really is kind of gripes me about SRS basal systems, people say it's great for rescue, but of course you don't know where the climber is going to be at that point. And if you're lowering somebody from that point, there's obviously, you never know how many scaffolds are going to be beneath them. So the chance of getting hung up is really high, I think. So, just thinking imaginatively now, if you have 2 points and you're lowering on 2 points, you're able to, move the climber around, at least in 2-dimensional space. Possibly.
Yeah, that's something I hadn't thought about, that actually makes the lowerable base anchors
much more feasible,
because you're not using your lanyard as much and able to direct.
Yeah, good point. There's less chance of your lanyard being installed at the point where something goes wrong, so the climber's not like stuck onto the branch. Yeah.
I had something to add also. If they're in the middle of their pendulum, right, they have their ropes angled up, and you can't really get them to drop in that space very easily. I've seen it in a couple like rescue scenarios and competition and training where you use like a thimble prusik and wrap it around one system and hook it to the other person's system above their device. So then it kind of anchors those two together so you can drop down.
Right. So you're redirecting their system onto yours and then coming down parallel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, stationary rope system, really, the world is your oyster in terms of rigging options, much more so than the moving rope system. Yeah. But, you know, as I've kind of tried to mention through, you know, the last 20 odd minutes of talking, I really tried to get rid of the so-called minor techniques and just keep everything super basic, super foundational. You know, you may know that technique, but who else does? But I'm guessing, you know, all of you know how to throw a rope, or at least should. You know, all of you should know about what is a dangerous rope angle and what is a well compressed limb. Yeah. Thank you anyway. So yeah, Sam, some stuff to chew on, and probably I should give it more thought to. So thanks for reminding me about it.
Well, one additional thought in this regard is probabilistically, if there is an incident that was to arise in needing a rescue, that person will be most likely working, thereby close to the trunk of the tree in that scenario. The scenario you describe of being suspended in midair sounds like an ascent or a descent position, more likely than not. And then your whatever tree access means would likely be able to reach that person because they would likely be working when that incident would arise. Of course, not 100%, but I think likely would be the case, and therefore close to the trunk or a branch.
Thank you. Okay, you guys can't see the illustrations yet, can you? What have I done wrong? Can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so triangulation. We've spoken about it enough, I guess. You understand my points about macro and micro positioning. And it's absolutely wonderful to know that you can move 6 inches, you guys, 3 inches to the right, just so you can see enough, you know, if your face cut is matching, or if you need to reach around with your secateurs to really cleanly take off that water chute. You know, really, really quite liberating to be able to have that freedom of two-dimensional movement while your body is, you know, in a relaxed state. Trailing ascension. So there's the roll clip thing, not roll clip, is it a roll clip? Yeah, roll clip that slides under the gray Unicender when I'm ascending up. So I'll ascend up on the gray rope, and then the orange Unicender is clipped on. So the MRS point on top of the Unicender, just clip them together and it almost frictionlessly follows along. And I'm sure there are ways to trail devices, different devices, but to be honest, I just haven't explored it personally. So this is kind of a bizarre one. Everyone still see that? 3-to-1 ascension. Yeah. So 3-to-1 ascension. I do actually use it in Japan's so mountainous, and I ended up working on steep slopes quite a lot. So more so than up in the tree, if I'm using ropes for stability on steep slopes, and I'm using 2 ropes, I can build in a mechanical advantage and then clip in the second SRS line, and I don't need to touch it, it just trails along, both descending and ascending. So it's a bit of a bizarre technique, but it's kind of interesting. And it's pretty much unique to the Unicender too, I think. You see the next one, counterbalance. So I actually do use this specifically for descent and retrieve in large trees. Wow, what kind of scenario? Okay, so I go up into a big cryptomeria softwood and I've put in 2 running bow lines, and then I'm using that as a high point to do some removal work or whatever, and I need to go back up and take the block out of the tree. So as I'm going up there anyway, I don't need to think about retrieve setting in the beginning, and then I'll remove the 2 running bow lines and just tie the 2 rope ends together and descend down on both unicenders. So the rope doesn't move, but the unicender moves along both lines. And then there's no choking knot and there's no hardware to retrieve at the end. It's just like pulling out a throw line. It's super, super confident about retrieving the rope from pretty much any situation. You can also climb on it, but it's kind of weird. So double line descent, I've mentioned this. The unicender basically functions like a figure-8 descender when you wrap it. So you're able to move your hands away from the device. And then you can control both hands. You can control both lines with either 1 hand or 2, especially for vertical descents. Or somebody, maybe Sam mentioned about are 2 easier than 1 when you're squeezing? Yes, you also have the option to squeeze both devices together because they don't perfectly sit together. And I've asked Rock Exotica to think about this, when they update the Unicender, if a device could sit really cleanly together, and then you're able to operate it with 1 hand, that would be super cool. To be honest, the Unicender is a little bit painful the way the top plates is designed. Self-explanatory, you're on 2 ropes and you can quickly come off 1 rope and then re-rig it into a redirect or whatever you have to do. The Unicender is, I think, by far the easiest device in those terms. And then when you're moving around in the crown, for example, you can grab both of them together very comfortably. Both fit into your hand, and you can just push them up like 2 hand ascenders. So single line descent, this is super cool. So 1 rope is wrapped, and then the Unicender has this bizarre function where if you drop the orange one down to a point, especially on harder ropes, like harder covered parallel core ropes, as you're coming down on the gray line, the Unicender on the orange line just self-tends back down, as in and I don't want to compare it too closely, but like an industrial access backup, like an ASAP, that will self-tend, follow the climber up and also follow the climber down. Well, the Unicender, it has this kind of capability too. It's amazing. It really, in complex trees when you're really having trouble navigating around branches and stuff, if you can just drop 1 into a self-trailing mode, it's really good. So I put this in a single system. Of course, this is a talk about 2 rope use, but in Japan, we're not obliged to use 2 ropes all the time, only while working. So if I need to, if 2 ropes are bothersome in a certain situation, I can simply just go and climb on 1 rope. And then again, Unicender off and on super quick. So that's it for the illustrations. Any questions there?
Yeah. Have you gotten away from using that 3-point connection little gyro? I forget what the trade name is of the little device that's in the illustration.
Yeah, I'll talk about that now. So basically, I was using the DMM one, that you can see in the illustration, but it was recalled, so it's out of use at the moment. Maybe let me turn this light up a bit. It's quite dark, isn't it? Oh, that's not my harness. Sorry, wrong thing. So at the moment, I have one swivel on the bridge, which you can all see, I guess. And then at the bottom of the tether, I also have a small swivel. So yes, three-way swivels make the management of two systems super clean. If you don't have a swivel on the Unicender, what happens quite easily is the Unicender ends up being faced upwards, which is not an ideal way to use it. So you want the swivel to then just orient it where it wants to be oriented. If it's not oriented where it doesn't want to be oriented, the rope then builds up friction. So to make everything as clean as possible, basically one on the device each, you know, like a spider jack has a swivel. What else has swivels? Zigzags. So yeah, buy a tri-swivel, like a gyro or the DMM things, or just use a normal swivel and then ensure that you have swivels on the device. Yeah.
Hello, I had two questions. First one was, can you think if someone's going to try and begin working these two rope system, obviously that tether aspect of the system is important. Can you think of any other disadvantages other than the working on a spar disadvantage that you gave earlier, just to look out for as you're learning to work with having your system suddenly further away from you? And then the second question, really quick, is I've looked into getting a Unicender. Have you ever considered using the attachments that Climbing Innovations made for it?
So yeah, when you're climbing up to an anchor, and you know, if your device can go super close to the anchor, sometimes that's helpful to, you know, you need to get up and over on top of the anchor, then maybe reset or whatever you have to do. So yeah, you're at a distance. But for me anyway, with my level of climbing, I can manage that. But you know, that's a personal thing. So yeah, I mean, don't shy away from it because it seems like a difficult thing. Maybe just rethink how you climb and how you move and things like this. The Climbing Innovations thing, I think the Unicender does need a pulley, and it would be cool if the rope could be captured in this bottom section, because when it does that, as it occasionally does, it's annoying. You simply have to put it back in. So while you're working, if you don't have to do that, that's a good thing. And the Climbing Innovations bar, it captures the rope nicely. I didn't like the top thing actually, because I tend to use skinnier ropes. And I like that there's quite a heavy amount of friction when you wrap directly to the Unicender. You know, the edges are quite coarse, they're quite sharp. So which means that you don't need to put much pressure in to hold the rope. You know, a lot of the friction is passed to the outer side of the Unicender. And the Climbing Innovations thing on my skinnier ropes, it was just way too fast. I didn't like it at all. The Climbing Innovations thing, for those that don't know, it's attachment that goes on the top here, and it's kind of bulbous. It has a really nice bend radius rather. And it just makes the rope like move through the Unicender really fast on that wrap descent. And then it makes it just a bit heavier and, you know, whatever. Is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, time's really flying by. Sorry to keep you. There's a bit more writing, but I think I'll leave the reading for there, and I just want to introduce one anchor. It'll take about another 10 minutes. 10 minutes if that's okay. I mean, in terms of how to anchor, I would say just anchor how you anchor and just double it up for the time being. And then, you know, once you get used to climbing on 2 ropes and you're, you know, if you really get into it and like it, like the next thing to think about is maybe if you're using two crown anchors on SRS, how, you know, there are ways that retrieving one then can retrieve the second one. So I call it piggybacking. You piggyback one to the other. So that makes retrieve a lot more slick. So one example, so one of the workshops I do for the guys that are being introduced to 2 rope, we always use one basal anchored system and then one not blocked system, if you guys know what not blocking is. So both of them are really low friction for retrieve, and they can be set to retrieve independently, or the knot block can just be tied on to the bottom anchor, and as you pull the bottom anchor, it just pulls out the knot block too. Does that make sense? Okay, confession, I kind of stole an idea from Buckingham. I guess Buckingham has stolen ideas from other people in the past too, so I don't feel too bad about it. There's something called the super saver, which I'm not really into, but there's one really cool aspect of the super saver that I saw. And ordinarily, a hardware like this, when you retrieve it, at the final point, it pulls and it free falls down from the tree, which, you know, it's kind of scary because it gets hung up so easily. And what the super saver does, you're able to rig in 2 ropes, and as you retrieve, like my counterbalance picture that I just showed you, the whole thing becomes a loop. Does that make sense? Okay, I'll just show you here on this thing. And what the super saver is basically is on one side you have a figure 8 this way with a large rig up, and then on one side you have a figure 8 with a large ring down. So one rope's put in and then blocked against a small ring. And then the other rope put in the other side. This is my design, which is not 2 figure 8s, but hopefully you get the idea. So one blocked on one side, one blocked on the other side. And then these can be plopped into redirects as you see fit. And then for retrieve, you pull those down. And then the retrieve cone goes up. And I've basically formed a loop. So as I pull one side, I carefully lower the whole thing out of the tree. Or, you know, sometimes when you're retrieving, because of the shape of the tree, it won't want to pull one direction. And if you only have the ability to pull in one direction, which ordinarily you do with one rope system, then you're stuck. You have to find a way to get back up into the tree. But if I get stuck pulling this way, I can then manipulate it by pulling the yellow side and then dropping it out that way. And then a smooth, refined retrieve, in my opinion. So yeah, there's some stuff online about the Super Saver, which you can check out. It'll give you more of an idea. So I'll just introduce this thing that shop ODSK and I have been making the last couple of months. I'll jack it off. There's a slightly advanced knot blocking technique called a Cannabase. Has anybody heard of that?
Yes.
Yep.
Would you be kind enough to explain it to everybody?
Using a Cannabase, you do a knot blocking on a friction saver underneath a union and then redirect up into smaller tie-in points to create a basal tie up in the canopy.
Thank you. Is that clear for everybody? Which I just think is super cool. You know, you're able to maintain a strong point of contact, you know, for the main part of the anchor. You're able to redirect the rope into higher points of the tree to give you better access, and then it compresses, but it puts more compression into the tree too, you know, if you rig it well. So yeah, a really amazing anchor. But it's bizarre because the ring and ring, ordinarily, when you load it, it pulls downwards. So you set it on top of a crotch and it pulls down. The Cannabase, you set it underneath the crotch, which is totally bizarre. And you would ordinarily need a cinching, you know, a movable prusik, so you can get the size, you know, exactly right, so it doesn't want to pull up and slide up. So there's the one big reason for making this thing. It's two ring and rings. There's a small ring on this side on the blue, and then a small ring on this side on the white. And what I found with something like the Super Saver, because the two ropes are going into the same piece of hardware, if the ropes are going to opposing parts of the tree, or anyway, just different parts of the tree, when you're pulling that to retrieve, one rope is pulling the hardware in one direction, spinning it in one direction, and the other rope is wanting to spin the hardware in the other direction. So you get this conflict, and there's a lot of friction to retrieve that. So I thought it would be better to have, you know, independence. So this part can, you know, manipulate into whatever shape it needs to go to let the rope run smooth, and then obviously that can manipulate to let the rope run smooth. So that's the basic concept, and you can also Cannabase it. So let me show you. So my neck is the crotch, and as I mentioned about MRS anchoring, it's very slick, just to push it through and be done. So push that through and then not block it. Put that down a bit. See that okay? Yeah, so push it through and then not block it onto the small ring. That's done. And then the Cannabase side, that would be passed over a limb. And then goes under the crotch. So that's not able to, as I load that, the branch stops it from pulling up, and then that's able to be loaded in this direction. And then what I tend to do, I don't choke myself by leaning down. What I tend to do, just so that things are kept really easy to understand and clear, I bring a different colored retrieve rope and just tie both loops into that. So, you know, then I don't need to use any carabiners into the eye of the butterfly. And then, yeah, I can basically climb to my heart's content without thinking really about retrieve friction at all. You know, you could take 3 redirects on this side, and then again, as long as the lines are kept relatively clean and not bending around branches, 2 or 3 redirects on each side, and then down to the floor, pulling this retrieve line. I'm going to garrot myself. So both, actually, I use a carabiners now. I just poke it through the rope. But your retrieve thing goes up and over through the redirects, and then you're able to retrieve it down to the floor. And that's it. So yeah, it's maybe not the simplest of anchors, but you know, if you're a bit of a tech head like me, that's super interesting, and it has a cool name. I was talking to the guys at the shop, obviously Japanese guys, and I was saying, look guys, you need to come up with a name for this thing. And one guy thought it looked like an old toy from the 80s that in Japan they called an American clacker. You know what that is? It's like, it's a bar and it's like a triangle shape with 2 balls at the end, and you bang it up and down. Pum, 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 pum. Anyway, so yeah, the American clacker. There you go. Okay, well, I think that's enough from me. Thank you for your time. If there's any questions or comments, happy to hear that.
With the American clacker, getting stuff from ODSK is a little bit difficult here.
Stuff used to do custom stitching.
Yeah, I've got a shop. Our session is like 30 minutes from my house, and they've got a stitching machine. Do you mind if we have those made?
I don't mind.
Okay.
Would that need to be stitched to life safety standards or anything, or like how is it being loaded? It doesn't seem like it does.
The rings need, obviously the rings need to be stitched to life.
No, I just mean the two friction savers together.
This part?
Yeah.
No, not life safety standard. It's basically the same amount of stitching.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
I mean, hands up, we haven't done certified strength testing on that section yet. So, you know, used tentatively, but you know, I've been using a variation, this one here, for 3 months or so, and there's absolutely still no damage at all on that stitched area. So yeah. And stitch placement, you see, is slightly offset. We've still not quite decided if to offset it or put it in the center. So yeah, still working out some details.
Are the large rings on the same side or opposite?
Or opposed?
Yeah, it's opposed.
Okay.
Let me just pull these ropes out and I'll give you a better look.
Hey, Paul, thanks for all the teaching, man, and everyone for the great input. Really appreciate it.
Thank you too. Thanks for joining us. So, okay, here's the blue one. It's obviously a DMM anchor ring. Doesn't have to be, but this is I'm just looking for the size. This is a 26 on one side, and then a 34 on the other. And then the white is the opposite to that. It has the 26 on that side and then the 34 on that. So the small rings are on or opposing sides.
Okay.
Yeah.
Paul, I think maybe one of the biggest things for me is I've trained 3 apprentices at this point, and learning how to get into a tree and work a tree is very overwhelming for someone starting. So, you know, in your opinion, and everyone else who's in the call here, like, how feasible is it to be sort of strictly requiring a beginner to use 2 ropes? In my mind, it's just too much. What is your opinion on that? And everyone.
Well, I'll go first. I think that in the UK, in some of the guidance, they suggest working trees on 2 MRS split tail systems, which for me is just mind-bogglingly difficult. I couldn't imagine the kind of the curmudgeonly movement and efficiency brought on by that. It would just be awful. But you know, I'm predominantly an SRS climber. Obviously, I do use MRS within that. You know, at times, but predominantly an SRS climber. So the rope length is halved. So that's one thing. And then SRS devices mechanical devices tend to have less base friction on the rope, so that's also easier to manage. And then lastly, as I mentioned in my writing, a beginner climber tends to be more able to take on, you know, an idea, not as a new idea, but just as an idea, rather than a climber with experience. You know, you get into routines of how to do things, and you know, it is what it is, right? It's hard to kind of veer away from that. So I do teach beginners 2 rope climbing, and one of the overwhelming feelings they have is, wow, in Japanese they say anshin. This is anshin, which means an amazing feel of security to be on 2 anchors and 2 ropes. You know, as Andrew mentioned, this comfortable feeling. If you want to call that a backup, you know, you can do, but I don't really see it as a backup. I just see it as a thing. And then being able to, as I've mentioned several times, be able to redirect and hold your body in suspension between 2 points, and then, you know, learn how to find work positions from 2 points. It's just so much easier, Patrick.
Sorry, I absolutely agree that it's phenomenal and it's better. I'm just struggling with the idea that an actual noob is going to be able to, you know, set up 2 ropes. I mean, for instance, like a top level question would be for you. You're on the ground looking at a tree that let's say a good tie-in point is 70 feet. You know, are you gonna take the time to use a throw line and set up 2 independently anchored spots at 70 feet before you even leave the ground?
For me, you mean?
For you, Paul, yeah.
No, I don't. It's as I say, in Japan, there's no legal requirement to move on 2 ropes, so it's always done on 1 rope. Access is always done on 1 rope.
Okay, I see.
Access on 1 rope, and then yeah. I mean, Patrick, without doubt, a noob can learn how to climb on 2 ropes, because I've taught dozens already in Japan, you know, beginner climbers. And just do, you know, the low and slow kind of thing. Just, you know, take it little by little, you know, implement a second rope in certain situations, and, you know, become accustomed to managing the 2 tails, become accustomed to belaying down on 2 systems, and you know, how to manage slack on 2 systems. So it's, you know, like anything, it's just a little increments at a time.
I have a long fascination with the interplay between technique and gear. You know what I mean? And how the development of one directly works with the development of the other. And what I like about the stuff that you've put out is it's not just technique, it's also gear. Like you're saying, you know, you use 2 unicenders, but you're saying at a minimum one of them should be a unicender because of the distinct advantages of that piece of gear.
Yeah.
So it's not as simple as saying just climb with 2 ropes, because like you're saying, you know, two doubled rope systems with hitch cords is untenable, right? So yeah.
And one more thing, there's probably many more things, but something that comes to mind is if I fail to be able to teach this to a new climber, the system as a whole is a failure. And one thing about, I was like really, really deeply into, well, I've been into many different systems throughout, you know, my career. And the TRT thing, I really felt that was going to be a way forward for SRS climbing because you could retrieve it. And, you know, it's too advanced. There's too much fear in using skinny lines, and there's too many techniques involved. But I really feel that the way that I've designed this system, it's so kind of, I think it's basically. There's not many techniques involved. There's not much gear involved either. You know, if you sat down and count it all up, you know, it's not a whole lot to take on board. And then it's just the important stuff of learning about tree species, tree strength, how to root in a tree, which, you know, the old timers, that was a key to their workflow and efficiencies anyway. It's whatever system they're on, it's knowing how to understand and navigate in a tree. And you know, that's like nothing to do with systems really.
Yeah, I think for me, I have a little bit of a problem with a technique, which is really awesome, but it only works with one device. You know what I mean? Because like I've been looking at the Unicender for 15 years, and I think it looks weird, or, you know, it looks futuristic, and I can't believe that it hasn't been updated since 2005, I think. And like, I actually just got one.
The Unicender is far from futuristic, I tell you.
No, I know. I mean, like I climb on 2 bulldog bones, and there are certain things like you're saying, like easy, quickly on and off for redirects is amazing with a device that comes on and off quick.
Yeah,
but part of me feels a little awkward showing something really cool and then saying, but you can only do that with the bulldog bone. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, but you know, there has to be a baseline somewhere, and I don't think everything should fall back down to friction hitches. You know,
I don't.
In Japan, the bulldog bone is way more expensive than the Unicender. You know, that's like super premium piece of gear. It's probably $150 more expensive than the Unicender over here.
Interesting.
Yeah. But I appreciate. Sorry, Sam. Just one more thing to Patrick. Patrick, I really appreciate your input, and yeah, I hope that we can keep this conversation going. And you know, I rotate my Unicenders in and out of service, so if one comes out of service that's still kind of usable, I'll send it over to you, and you can have a play on it. How about that?
Well, I actually 2 days ago I found one on TreeBay on Tree Buzz that they sell. You can buy stuff, and I just found it's actually the modified one that we were talking about earlier with climbing innovations. So that should be here in a few days. So I can't wait to play with it.
Yeah, wicked. Nice.
Yeah.
A lot of what I've been taking from I primarily climb on the akimbo, and I've been trying to think of how to take a lot of the techniques you're using with the Unicender and apply that to the akimbo. And I think some will work, most are going to be a little iffy. But yeah, I've already got one Unicender and another one. As soon as they come in, I'm going to pick one up. So I'll be playing with
a guy that I work with a lot. He's studied my 2-rope thing, and he ended up with his. Well, I'm not sure which one's the main, or with two systems, no one is the main. But anyway, he uses one akimbo, one unicender always. And for him, he's basically pruning trees. He does removals very occasionally, but yeah, a lot of redirecting, and yeah, the akimbo and the uni combo for him works really, really smoothly. Yeah, thanks, Sam. Nice to see you, mate. And let me know how you get on with the ISC thing.
Absolutely. I'll put one of those together and make a couple.
It would be
posts.
cool with a large and a small one either side, like a flint locker, but with no friction for retrieve. That just looks amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as soon as I saw that, I thought of a midline attachable canopy anchor.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks, mate. Okay, anybody questions or some comment?
Just to Patrick's question, there are, so you had two questions, I guess, or more than two, but two I'd like to address. One is about your second question was, is it possible to set a 70-foot anchor point, two independent lines quickly and efficiently, and to have a newbie use them? Yes.
Yeah.
So I've spent a few years trying to answer questions exactly like that and doing it a bunch of different ways. And I won't turn this into the Andrew show and talk about that, but I'd love to talk about it more.
Andrew, please go ahead, as long as you like.
Okay. One thing that I've had a lot of success with is so a trick I picked up from Jeff Inman with the throw line is you get your high spot set, and then you can just double bag your second throw line somewhere lower than your first one. So you throw once, set two independent lines. If that second line is lower and like consider your bomb-proof anchor, what I've found is that I like to do is the high one's my canopy anchor, the low one's my basal anchor. And I'll use the basal anchor to access and trail my second system on the canopy anchor. What I really like about that is I know I'm climbing on the bomb-proof anchor, and once I get higher, I'm in a position to actually inspect my canopy anchor before I commit to it. As well as then I can switch over to the canopy anchor if I only want to work one line, or pull the tail up for the basal anchor, turn that into an additional canopy anchor, have the person on the ground untie the basal end. This is easier done if you have something that comes on and off the rope quickly. You could have a third line, leave the basal as an access line, and then have your two lines. There's a bunch of things you could do, but that basic setup of one high, one low, I really like. But yeah, your first question about like, what's the best way to train somebody? I don't know that it is. It depends on the kind of work you do, I think. If we're saying there's a rule that you have to be tied in twice, and the kind of work you do is starts from the ground and you spike up a tree and you remove the tree, you dismantle the tree, then yeah, maybe it is a hitch climber system and two lanyards, so that if you disconnect one, you're still always tied in twice. If you're pruning smaller trees, 30-foot tall trees, and you're climbing the tree all the time, or if you're climbing the tree like a ladder and you're advancing, as Paul said, the easiest anchor to advance is a moving rope open system, right? Moving rope is good for advancing and retrieving. Nothing's easier to advance and retrieve. Stationary rope is good for redirects. So much easier to redirect a stationary line than a moving rope line. Two moving rope systems all the time, that's pretty impractical most of the time. So have I answered your question? I don't know. It depends. I think that some cases the easiest way to train somebody would be a hitch climber system, one hitch climber system. But is it easy to teach someone to climb rope into a tree with two lines? I think it is.
Yeah, I mean, there was a long-standing debate between doubled rope and SRT. And for the longest time, people would say if you're starting with a beginner, you should always train them first on doubled rope, because that's where the history of tree climbing, before you show them SRT, because the idea is that SRT is way more complicated. And I always said forever, like, it's not way more complicated, it's just more options. So you can just as easily train a beginner on SRT, and I've done it with 3 guys. It was no problem whatsoever. But I'm not talking about that. Like, I love your idea of what you're saying for Jeff Inman, showing like setting 2 anchors with off of 1 throw. Like, one of my apprentices, Tom, like, he has it in his head. This is off on a tangent. He has it in his head that, like, he's gonna hit a great tie-in point from the ground, and then he's just gonna do the whole tree from there. And like, oh my God, he'll mess around like 45 minutes to set 1 line, and I'm like, what the hell are you doing? Just get in the tree. You know what I mean? And so, like, in my mind, when you're saying like, oh, it has to be 2 lines from the ground, I'm thinking, oh my God, they're gonna take 45 minutes for the first one. How long is the second one gonna take? You know what I mean? It's just it's a mindset thing, and it's, yeah. I mean, I know that it's possible. It's like, does the beginner know that it's possible? And that's where it comes down to communication and training, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many, as we learned, I think that one of the best parts about following the progression of SRT is all the minor techniques that Paul talked about. When you rely on only 1 line, you have to have a huge bag, especially when it's SRT. You have to have a huge bag of minor techniques, and it's awesome to have those. And so there's a ton of different ways to approach it. I do believe that 2 lines redundancy can be safer in many scenarios. I mean, because if we listen to Dr. John Ball, he talks about the ways that people get killed every year, and it's always struck bys, electrocution, and falls from trees, right? And a lot of those falls from trees are people becoming disconnected from their system. So we don't need redundancy because we're cutting our lines. We don't need redundancy because our gear's failing. We need redundancy because we're accidentally unclipping from our systems. And when we rely on only 1 system, the penalty for that mistake is like the death penalty, which I don't think it should be.
Sorry, Andrew, the guy in Sweden called Joe Stockton, he did a poll a couple of years ago about anchor accidents, and he was able to gather quite a bit of data. I think over 100 climbers answered him, and it was shocking how many anchor points snapped.
Yes,
I was so shocked. And this has nothing to do with SRS. These are the majority were MRS, and nothing against MRS, but basically, like, people are snapping out anchor points left, right, and center. I was so shocked.
Yeah. People, a lot of the fatalities are failed anchor points, and sometimes it's tree failure. So people falling from trees or people falling with trees. But that's user error. That's a lapse in judgment, which is that's what's killing us.
Yeah, and one thing I think an amazingly missed opportunity in the UK was they could have taken the opportunity to completely redefine like how you go about studying safety at height and choosing anchors, and they didn't change anything. They simply said use a second rope, and here's some technical guidance. Here's 2 Prusik systems. It was they could have gone over to an hour-based system for training. They could have done a whole bunch of things, but they really took the easy route.
Yeah.
May I add for something like that? Just when training someone new all the time, what someone's passed along to me, I think it was Eric Palacios, was the idea of just, in lieu of maybe fixing this idea of having 2 systems at all times, just always having if you're over 35-40 feet, having a dedicated SRS access rope at all times, even when training that new person, whether you put them on that system or not, or just have it dedicated yourself next to mirroring that person's work and movements through the tree or coaching them along. I mean, that's highly crucial. And I don't know, for any apprentice, even if someone prefers an MRS system, you know, a lot of what I do in these wide, you know, hugely horizontal trees that aren't very tall in the Texas area because they've adapted to the desert is, you know, go up SRS and then move over to my moving rope system in a friction saver. So I'm not wasting all that time, you know, usually using something like a basal tie or, you know, just a simple canopy anchor really quick to get there, and then, you know, set my juicy little higher tie-in point or further out tie-in point after that, and just always keeping that dedicated, you know, SRS line there at, you know, may have been a great alternative to constantly having to be on a twin rope system or a 2-rope system. I don't know.
No, totally, I agree. It's that's a really positive and practical way to think about it. And it just, as you were talking, you know, there was a little bit of chat about the rescue thing of 2 lines, and I think a really fundamental thing about rescue preparation is having a rescue line installed in the tree at all times. And how many of us do that? It's so simple. We'd rather talk about, you know, complex rescue technical situations. What would you do in this situation, this situation? And rescue is never about that. It's so bare bones basic, you know, for probably 90 odd % of the time, and having the ability to access into the tree, you know, like that's just the most crucial thing. And then, yeah, the rope's there, and if you need to use it to take out or help you with a redirection point or a, you know, suspension point, you just use it because it's there. Yeah. But then you're like, well, it's not a rescue line anymore. Whatever.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff Jepson mentions that in the Tree Climber's Companion from 23 years ago. It's right amazing. There. Like, you should install a second line. And every year when I go back through that book, I see that and I'm like, oh my God, I should be using a second line. And I have experimented with it. And, you know, I do it a few times. I do it for a couple of weeks, and then it just kind of falls by.
I tell you what I do. I mean, this may be of interest or not. I mentioned that I have 2 30-meter working lines, but I also have a 60-meter 10 mil. What's 10 mil? Is that 3/8? You know, a thin line that a new Unicender can function on. So 60-meter for access. I'll set that and I'll anchor it at a basal anchor, and then I'll go up that, and then I won't touch it because personally I don't need it. I've got 2 then separate working lines, but then that rope just stays in the tree then as a, you know, want to call it an access line or want to call it a rescue line, whatever. There's a rope in the tree. So yeah, for me, that's quite a practical way to kind of find a solution.
Mm-hmm.
I have a bit of input for training newbies on working multiple lines. I guess I just started training newer climbers within the last like year and a half of my career. But I kind of drew back on how I started learning how to work 2 different lines, or like 1.5 lines, right? Was dragon sailing, coming back from limb walks.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I have an akimbo and a rope runner pro, so I keep the akimbo on my hip and I use it for dragon's tail. And with my trainees, I started having them bring up an extra pulley and an extra hitch and experiment with a dragon tail coming back from limb walks, or like on our smaller, like kind of wide deciduous trees, you know, I'll have them hit something in the center, and then as they go out on each lead, I have them do a dragon's tail on that lead, so that they can kind of work in that 2-dimensional space, right? So they can experiment with having 2 work positioning instead of having to like lanyard in over and over again, because I feel like they burn a lot of time just like figuring out where to lanyard in and adjusting those systems. And that's, you know, that's kind of how I broke into working 2 different directions consistently. So that's kind of how I've been teaching that to my trainees also.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, incrementally, we learn from trees, right? It's how they grow. It's little by little. It's and we need time. We need time to build up experience and knowledge, and to then eventually hopefully find a way to put that to good use, but incrementally, having the feeling of being suspended on 2 points, however you want to do it. For me, it was, I started by taking a smaller MRS system, and when needed, it would be pulled out. It would be a traverse system, stroke, secondary MRS system, whatever. But, having that feeling, and it is a feeling, Andrew mentioned to be comfy at the beginning, to have that comfortable feeling, and then find a way that I could, design a system where I could maintain that feeling, that amazing feeling at all times, or as much as possible. That was kind of a big motivation. But yeah, little by little. Sounds great. Let me know how you get on. Sounds really cool. And you say you're only 5 years into, so for you, this sounds like a really exciting learning curve as well.
Like going to multiple systems?
No, didn't you say you were climbing for 5 years and then rock climbing before that?
Yeah, a bit of rock climbing before that.
Yeah. So I mean, for anything like the investigation of technique and application, it must be really exciting.
Yeah,
I envy.
Really. A lot of fun. I really love, situations like this, coming in and being around a bunch of experience and learning from people who know more than me,
Well, take it with a pinch of salt. I guess that's the best advice I can give.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you very much. So anything else, guys?
Well, I've got a question on kind of an unrelated note, if that's all right. In terms of logistically speaking, getting that, let's say you've got your central tie-in point and then you've got your second line then redirected over something. The further you get that redirected over, that increases like the span over which you can comfortably work, right?
Yeah.
How logistically speaking do you tend to establish that primary redirect? I only ask because that kind of perfect shot that you're looking for is actually going to be pretty far laterally away from your starting point. Are you up there with like the Jerry Baronic style fly reel with throw line on it, or like how are you managing that logistically speaking?
So generally speaking, I can show you. I mean, if it's really far away, you need a throw line and you need to work with the ground worker, and it needs to be done like that. For the trees that I tend to work in, it's manageable by myself with this really simple technique that I'll show you now. Nothing groundbreaking here, very practical. So as a rule, I go to a higher point and then I try to throw downwards to the redirect point, wherever possible. That's just common sense. And then when the redirect is taken, I will leave a certain amount of rope to hang down, and the measurement of that rope will be low enough so that I can descend, create a longer pendulum on this rope, and I'm ordinarily still attached to this rope too, and then I will swing across, grab the redirected tail, and then swing back. So we're talking 10 feet, what's that? 10 feet maximum, 10, 15 feet maximum. Or, sometimes I'll climb on the structure, and I'll be able to go even a bit further. But certainly I will ordinarily grab the tail and then just swing back. And what swinging back allows me to do is to, as I mentioned, I can just take my weight off of this side then. I'm still in suspension here. And re-rig the device. And then just start to move then into position on the two lines. So that's my kind of go-to technique in the trees that I work over here. If you're talking about a much larger expanse, yeah, it would be, I have used that little hook, got one here somewhere, years ago. I mean, I would probably not ever use it again. I'd just pull up a throw line from the floor and, or, you know, think about it before I get into the tree and, you know, set it from the ground or something like that.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much. Nice to see your faces. Hope we can keep this conversation going on, you know, on Instagram and maybe do another webinar in the future sometime. And, you know, any questions, anytime, send it over to my email. Whatever. So, yeah, happy to help out where I can. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Arigato. It's good to talk to everybody.
Thank
Paul.
you.
Arigato
Yeah,
gozaimasu.
Great to talk. Nice to meet you guys.
Conversation. I appreciate all of your input.
Yeah, I appreciate you too. Thank you.
Thank you,
Much
guys.
appreciated. Thank you all.
Yep. Thanks all.
ありがとうございます。
Ah, Toku, arigato.
ありがとうございます。うん。
Thanks a lot, Paul.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too, likewise.
Nice to meet you, Andrew. Everybody.
Yeah, you as well.